They say that 300 Spartans stood alone against an empire. 300 men, shoulder to shoulder, defying a king who called himself divine. But legends have a way of polishing reality until truth becomes myth. And the truth of Thermopylae is far greater, darker, more human, and far more extraordinary than the heroic fragments we hear today. To understand why 300 men marched toward certain death, we must first turn back the clock 10 years to a dusty plain outside Athens, where the world's greatest empire tasted humiliation for the first time. It was the Battle of Marathon, a moment the Persians believed would end in swift obedience, a lesson to punish a rebellious little democracy across the sea. Yet instead, it became the spark that ignited a fire powerful enough to scorch an empire. In 490 BC, Darius the Great, ruler of half the known world, sent his armies west to crush Athens for daring to resist Persian authority. But instead of an easy conquest, his soldiers found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by a much smaller Athenian force. The Athenians fought with desperation, determination, and a fierce belief that no king had the right to own the soul of free men. The Persians expected submission. What they got instead was defeat, unexpected, unforgettable, and deeply insulting. For Darius, the loss at Marathon was more than a military setback. It was a personal wound. In the Persian world, a king was no ordinary man. He was heaven's chosen authority on earth, and no chosen king could tolerate such defiance. He vowed to return, to erase Athens, to remind Greece of its place beneath the Persian throne. But time, fate, and illness stopped him. Darius died before he could fulfill his oath of vengeance. Onto the throne stepped his son, Xerxes, a man raised not simply to rule, but to conquer. Xerxes inherited not only an empire of impossible size, stretching from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Egypt, from the valleys of India to the plains of Babylon, he also inherited his father's rage. To him, this war was not merely political, it was sacred. A holy duty to avenge his father's shame and prove his own divine legitimacy. So Xerxes built an army unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. From every corner of his vast dominion, he summoned soldiers. Archers from Media, cavalry from Bactria, sailors from Phoenicia, spearmen from Egypt, immortals from Persia itself. Ancient historians spoke of over 1 million troops marching under his banner. While modern scholars estimate the truth closer to 200,000, the reality remains the same. No force on earth had ever been larger, richer, or more terrifying. His army was so immense, stories claimed it drank rivers dry as it passed. Entire cities emptied themselves to feed and supply his legions. The roads trembled under the weight of soldiers, horses, siege engines, craftsmen, slaves, and an endless caravan of provisions stretching so far that the end could not be seen from the beginning. Yet even nature dared to stand against him. When a violent storm destroyed the first bridge of ships he built to cross the Hellespont, the narrow strait dividing Asia and Europe. Xerxes flew into a rage so fierce that he ordered the waters whipped 300 times and branded with hot irons, as if punishing the sea itself for disobedience. Then he commanded the engineers to build the bridge again, and they did. Stronger, wider, more ambitious. When it was complete, the Persian army marched across the floating highway as though crossing from one world to another. And so the tide of Persia began its slow, unstoppable advance toward Greece. Panic swept the Greek world long before the first Persian boot touched their soil. This land was not a unified nation. It was a collection of fiercely independent city-states, bound more by rivalry than friendship. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, each prided itself on its identity, culture, and military pride. But when news arrived that Xerxes was marching with a force so immense it defied imagination, the Greeks realized a truth more terrifying than war. Divided, they would be destroyed. Some northern states surrendered immediately, choosing life under Persia over annihilation. Others hesitated, unsure whether resistance was bravery or madness. But one city did not tremble. One city had been preparing for this moment all its life.
Burn!
Sparta,
Athens!
a land where warriors
Let
were
their
molded,
defiers
not
turn
born,
to ash.
where every boy was stripped from comfort, forged through discipline, and taught that fear was an enemy to be conquered. Spartans were raised to fight, to obey, and to die if the state demanded it. Their lives were harsh, their training brutal, and their ethos unwavering. They lived for one purpose: battle, and at their head stood King Leonidas. A leader shaped by duty, hardened by discipline, and destined for immortality. Not through victory, but through sacrifice. As Greek delegates met to discuss what to do, Leonidas stepped forward with a plan as bold as it was desperate. They would block the Persian advance at a narrow pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. Thermopylae was no ordinary battlefield. It was nature's fortress, a twisting corridor carved between steep cliffs on one side and the Aegean Sea on the other. The narrowest point was barely wide enough for a wagon. There, no matter how vast the Persian army was, it could never bring its full strength to bear. There, numbers meant nothing. There, skill, discipline, and courage could hold back an empire. The Greeks formed the Hellenic League, Athens, Sparta, and a handful of allies, promising to stand together. The Athenian general Themistocles proposed a daring dual strategy: hold the Persians by land at Thermopylae, while the Greek fleet blocked them by sea at Artemisium. The plan was dangerous, unpredictable, and hinged entirely on one question: could Leonidas hold the Hot Gates long enough?
Rally dead.
As dawn
Rally
broke
the
over the
remaining
rugged
vessels.
mountains of central Greece, Leonidas set out with his chosen men. Only 300 Spartans, a tiny fraction of Sparta's might. But these 300 were not ordinary soldiers. They were handpicked, each a veteran, each a father of living sons. Leonidas deliberately chose men whose lineage would survive even if they did not, because he knew they would not return. As they marched north, villagers watched them pass. 300 crimson cloaks fluttering in the wind, shields polished like mirrors, spears upright and unwavering. Behind them marched thousands of allies: Thespians, Phocians, Thebans, Arcadians, nearly 7,000 in total. A small army by any measure, dwarfed by the tidal wave creeping ever closer. When they reached Thermopylae, the heat rising from the sulfur springs gave the pass its name, the Hot Gates. There, Leonidas found an ancient wall, crumbling and old. He ordered it rebuilt, reconstructed stone by stone, turning the narrowest point into a killing ground. It would be here, in this bottleneck between mountain and sea, that the fate of Greece would be decided. Meanwhile, far to the north, the earth trembled beneath the march of Xerxes'
Mutilate
host.
his corpse and display
Witnesses
it
spoke
for all
of
to
columns
see.
stretching beyond the horizon, of the thunder of hooves and the metallic whisper of countless spearheads catching the sun. The Immortals, Xerxes' elite guard of 10,000, marched at the center, silent, disciplined, and deadly. Each time one fell, another stepped forward to take his place, giving the illusion that their number never diminished. Behind them, the King of Kings rode in splendor atop a golden chariot, his towering presence surrounded by attendants, guards, and banners shimmering with precious jewels. To his enemies, he was a conqueror. To his subjects, a god. To Leonidas, he was simply a tyrant. When the advancing Persian scouts finally reached the pass and reported the size of the Greek force, Xerxes laughed. He believed the Spartans were not defenders, but madmen. For 4 days, he waited, expecting the Greeks to retreat, surrender, or flee. But the Spartans did none of those things. Instead, they repaired their armor, sharpened their spears, drilled in perfect formation, and sang their battle hymns, as if preparing for a festival rather than the greatest battle of their lives. When Xerxes' messenger demanded the Greeks lay down their arms, Leonidas answered with 2 immortal words, Molon Lab. Come and take them. The message was clear. The Persians would not pass easily. They would pass only through fire, blood, and iron. The stage was set. The mountains held their breath. The sea murmured against the rocks as if whispering warnings, and at the hot gates, 7,000 Greeks stood ready, staring into the face of an empire with nothing but shields, spears, and an unbreakable will. The storm was coming, and when it struck, the world would remember Thermopylae forever. The morning the Persians advanced toward Thermopylae, the air hung heavy with heat and anticipation. The cliffs rose like jagged guardians above the pass, casting long shadows that stretched across the cramped battlefield. Beneath those shadows, the Spartans prepared for the sound of war, not with fear, but with a strange, almost chilling calm. They were men who had been raised inside the furnace of the Agoge, who had been taught since childhood that death in battle was the highest honor. The sight of Persia's columns did not break them. It focused them. From his golden throne positioned on a nearby rise, Xerxes watched the thin Greek line with curiosity, amusement, and growing irritation. How could such a tiny force dare to block the road of an empire? He gave the order, the drums thundered, and the first wave of Medes and Scythians surged forward. Their war cries echoed between the mountains as they rushed into the narrow path. They expected the Greeks to break, to scatter before them like animals driven into a trap. But the Spartans did not scatter. They did not retreat. They did not even flinch. Leonidas stood at the center of his phalanx, shield raised, spear angled forward, eyes fixed with serene intensity. As the Persians charged, he gave a single command, calm, measured, and resolute, and the Greek shields locked together with a metallic rumble that sounded like the closing of a great iron gate. The collision was brutal. Persian momentum slammed into Spartan discipline. The front ranks of Medes found themselves crushed against the wall of bronze and oak, their lighter wicker shields splintering, their shorter spears snapping uselessly against Greek armor. The Spartans moved like a single living creature, advancing in tight formation, pushing with their shields, stabbing with deadly precision, always conserving energy, always stepping forward together. Their training was not loud or frantic. It was purposeful, methodical, merciless. Persian bodies began to fall, piling against the rocky ground. The narrowness of the pass betrayed them. They could not flank the Greeks. They could not bring their superior numbers to bear. They were suffocating in a bottle designed by nature and reinforced by Spartan genius. When the Medes faltered, Xerxes sent in fresh troops. Wave after wave crashed into the Greek line, but each broke and dissolved against the unyielding wall of bronze. Leonidas rotated his men in shifts, ensuring none grew too tired. The Persians, by contrast, grew exhausted and desperate. They were fighting an enemy with no fear, No hesitation, no weakness. By midday, the pass reeked of sweat, iron, and death. The Persian dead lay scattered like fallen wheat after harvest. Yet Xerxes refused to believe what his eyes were telling him, that his glorious army, the pride of the empire, was being held by a few thousand Greeks. And so he unleashed the next test. From his vantage point, he watched as the second wave approached. Archers, hundreds, perhaps thousands. They advanced in disciplined formations, nocked their arrows, and drew their strings. The sun glimmered on the arrowheads, turning the sky into a field of steel. The order was given. The arrows rose into the sky like a dark cloud drawn toward the heavens, then curved downward in a lethal rain. They fell thick and fast, so numerous that, as a Greek soldier later remarked, they blotted out the sun. The Spartans only smiled. "Well then," one of them joked, "we shall have our battle in the shade." The arrows struck, but they struck bronze, oak, and muscle honed to unbreakable discipline. The phalanx did not waver. The Greeks crouched behind their shields as the iron storm rattled off their armor. When the hail ended, the Spartans rose as one, brushed the dust from their cloaks, and stepped forward again. Xerxes grit his teeth. If his ordinary troops could not succeed, he would send his best. He signaled for the immortals. 10,000 elite warriors stepped into formation, taller, heavier armored, and better trained than the common soldier. Their faces were covered behind elaborate masks, their spears longer, their discipline unmatched. They had never been defeated. They were the emperor's pride, the blade of Persia's military might. They entered the pass in silence. The Greeks watched them come unafraid. There were no taunts, no boasts. Only the steady tightening of grips on spears and the quiet, rhythmic breaths of men who had fought all day and were ready to fight all night if they must. The immortals struck like a hammer, but the Spartan shield wall did not break. Leonidas ordered a feigned retreat, a sudden, controlled fallback that lured the immortals deeper into the narrow kill zone. Believing the Spartans were faltering, the immortals surged forward, and that was the moment the trap closed. Leonidas gave a shout. The Spartans spun, driving forward like a tide of iron. The immortals found themselves crushed between shields, tripped by the bodies of their own men, stabbed by spears too short for their formation. Their long spears snapped under the weight. Their training, as fine as it was, could not compensate for the brutal geometry of the terrain. Xerxes rose from his throne, furious, screaming orders that even his attendants hesitated to obey. Herodotus later wrote that the king leapt from his seat 3 separate times in disbelief as he watched his elite guard suffer heavy losses. All day long, the battle raged. At times, the Greeks surged forward, driving the Persians back. At other times, they held firm, letting the enemy exhaust themselves. The sun dipped low, casting an eerie red glow across the battlefield, turning the hot gates into a landscape of shadows and scarlet-stained earth. By nightfall, the Persians had achieved nothing but death. Greek spirits soared. Around their campfires, they sang hymns of courage, their voices echoing through the mountains. They sharpened their blades and cleaned their shields. They tended to the wounded. They laughed. They spoke of their homes, of Sparta, of their families. They spoke of honor. Meanwhile, the Persian camp was a different world entirely, clouded with frustration, fear, and disbelief. The soldiers whispered that the Greeks were protected by gods, that no mortal men could stand against the empire with such ferocity. Even the immortals were shaken. Xerxes himself was silent behind the draped curtains of his pavilion, contemplating the unthinkable. The greatest army in the world had been stopped. But the Greeks did not yet know that the gods, or perhaps fate or human treachery, were about to intervene. In the darkness beyond the Persian fires, a solitary figure crept toward Xerxes' officers. His name was Ephialtes, a man born in the shadow of these very mountains, and in his heart, greed smothered loyalty. For a purse of gold, he would betray the land of his birth. He would reveal the hidden path, the Anopeia Trail, a narrow, winding passage through the mountains that would allow the Persians to flank the Greek position. And with that betrayal, the fate of Leonidas and his men began to turn. The hot gates would become their tomb. Their stand would become legend. But the dawn had not yet come. The final day awaited. Night clung to the cliffs of Thermopylae like a shroud, cold and silent, broken only by the distant crackle of Persian campfires. The Greeks slept in uneasy shifts, dreaming of home, of loved ones they might never see again, while the Spartans sharpened their blades beneath the pale glow of the moon. For Leonidas, sleep did not come. He stood at the edge of the camp, staring into the darkened mountains, as though he could sense the storm gathering in the shadows. And indeed it was. Far above the Greek position, hidden among twisted roots and jagged stones, a narrow mountain path wound like a serpent through the ridgeline. Few knew it existed. Fewer still knew how to navigate it. But Ephialtes, twisted by greed, envy, and resentment, knew every inch of it. He led the immortals along this treacherous trail, their torches flickering like sinister fireflies, weaving through the darkness. The Greek sentries assigned to guard the path were Phocians. Brave, yes, but not Spartans, and certainly not expecting a stealth assault in the dead of night. When they awoke to the sound of snapped branches and soft marching, the Persian vanguard was already upon them. The Phocians scrambled into formation, but the immortals ignored them entirely. Their objective lay beyond, down the slope behind the Spartan position, toward the heart of the pass. By the time dawn's first pale light stretched its fingers across the peaks, the trap was nearly closed. A lone Phocian scout ran breathlessly into the Greek camp, shouting warnings, his face ashen. Leonidas listened without a word. He did not curse, did not rage, did not stagger. He simply nodded. He had known, deep in some unspoken corner of his heart, that the gods might require this sacrifice. The oracle had foretold it. Either Sparta would fall, or a Spartan king must die. Now the choice was made for him. He summoned his commanders, his voice steady and devoid of fear. He told them the truth plainly. The Persians would soon surround them, and the pass was lost. The Greek force must withdraw while escape was still possible. The allies argued, pleaded, hesitated, but Leonidas did not waver. "Go," he told them. "Save your men. Save Greece. We will hold the pass for as long as our bodies can stand." The army began to pull back, yet not all left. 700 Thespians, led by their commander Demophilus, refused to abandon Leonidas. They chose to stay and die beside him, not out of obligation, but out of honor. The Thespians loved freedom as fiercely as any Spartan, and they knew that this last stand would echo through the ages. 400 Thebans remained as well, though many claim they stayed under duress, their loyalty to the Greek alliance dubious. Still, they would face their fate alongside the others. In total, fewer than 1,500 men prepared to stand against tens of thousands. Leonidas moved through the ranks. placing a hand on the shoulder of each Spartan, speaking to them not as king to soldiers, but as father to sons. He told them to eat a hearty breakfast, for by nightfall they would feast in Hades. The Spartans laughed, not because they did not believe him, but because there was honor in meeting one's fate with a steady heart. The sun rose red that morning, as if dipped in blood. Leonidas did not wait behind the rebuilt wall. He led his men out into the wider part of the pass, choosing to meet the Persians head-on. This was not a defensive stand anymore. It was a final charge, a challenge hurled into the face of an empire. The Persians descended from the hills like a black tide, their armor gleaming with dew, their battle cries shattering the morning silence. Ahead was the main Persian army, stretching endlessly. Behind came the immortals, closing the trap. Leonidas and his men were surrounded, but they fought as though they had 1,000 allies at their backs. The clash was immediate and savage. The Spartans drove forward with a fury that shook the ground. Their spears struck like lightning. Their shields became hammers. Every motion was deliberate, deadly, and honed through decades of training. Thespian spears thrust alongside Spartan arms. The Thebans, though less disciplined, fought with the wild desperation of men who realized escape was no longer possible. Wave after wave of Persians fell. The bodies piled up so quickly that the Spartans used them as makeshift barriers. Arrows rained from above, but the Spartans raised their shields and pushed onward. They fought like wolves cornered by hunters, ferocious, relentless, burning with righteous fire. Herodotus tells us that when their spears shattered, they drew their swords. When their swords broke, they used their hands, and when their hands were torn and bleeding, they fought with teeth, with rocks, with anything they could grasp. They were no longer soldiers. They had become the very embodiment of defiance. In the chaos of battle, Leonidas strode among the front ranks, a towering figure marked by sweat, blood, and unbreakable resolve. Persian arrows pierced his shield. Blades scraped his armor. He was wounded, but he never slowed. And then, at last, it happened. A volley of arrows struck him, one in the thigh, another in the shoulder, and a final shot that pierced beneath his ribs. Leonidas staggered. His men shouted his name. The Persians surged forward to claim the prize. With a final burst of strength, the Spartan king fought them off until his legs could hold him no longer. Leonidas fell. His collapse sent a tremor through both armies. For the Persians, it was a moment of triumph. For the Greeks, it was the beginning of the end. But the Spartans would not surrender their king's corpse. 3 times they drove back the Persians, retrieving Leonidas's body in a desperate, bloody struggle that turned the earth black with spilled lives. They formed a circle around him, protecting him even in death. Xerxes watched from his throne. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. He had not expected such defiance. He had not expected to see the earth stained with the blood of so many Persians. Even now, as the last survivors formed a dwindling ring around their fallen king, the Spartans refused to yield. Enraged beyond measure, Xerxes gave the final order. Persian archers stepped forward, knocked their arrows, and raised their bows in unison. The sky darkened once more. The Greeks lifted their shields, but exhaustion weighed upon them like chains. The final storm came swiftly, ruthlessly. When the rain of iron ceased, the hot gates fell silent. Every defender of the last stand lay dead, but none had run, none had begged, none had surrendered. Xerxes approached the battlefield, stepping over broken shields and blood-soaked stones. His victory had come, but at a cost so heavy it soured the taste. In fury, he ordered the body of Leonidas mutilated, decapitated, and displayed upon a cross. It was an act meant to break Greek morale. Instead, it forged a legend that would soon ignite all of Greece. When the dust finally settled at Thermopylae, when the screams faded and only the whisper of the wind remained, Xerxes stood victorious in body but shaken in spirit. The pass was his. The Spartans were dead. Leonidas, mutilated and nailed upon a wooden cross, hung as a testament to Persia's wrath. Yet something was wrong, terribly wrong. The King of Kings had won the battle, but he felt no triumph. Instead, his victory tasted hollow, bitter, poisoned by the knowledge that a few hundred Greeks had carved tens of thousands of his soldiers into the earth. Thermopylae was supposed to be a warning to Greece. But as news spread across the land, it became something else entirely. Not a warning. A rallying cry. The story of Leonidas and the 300 raced across city-states like wildfire whipping through dry fields, in crowded agoras and quiet temples, in taverns filled with sailors and councils filled with generals. The tale of the last stand echoed with raw power. A king who marched knowingly into death. Warriors who stood against impossible odds. A sacrifice that bought their people time to breathe. Time to unite, time to prepare. They fought for us. They died for us. They did not kneel. For the first time in generations, Greeks who had once argued, quarreled, even fought each other, now found themselves speaking the same words, feeling the same fire. Thermopylae had done what diplomacy never could. It forged unity from fear and admiration. Xerxes, meanwhile, pushed south with his massive army, believing Greece would collapse just as swiftly as the pass had. Villages emptied as the Persians advanced. Fields were burned. Temples toppled. The king's wrath was unrelenting. The eastern horizon glowed red each night from fires lit by soldiers who took delight in destruction. Xerxes wished to break Greece's spirit. He did not yet realize that the spirit he sought to crush had already been set ablaze. Athens lay directly in the path of the invading force, the heart of Greek culture, a cradle of philosophy, art, and the fragile new idea of democracy. The city prepared for war, but even they knew they could not withstand such overwhelming numbers on land. Themistocles, the brilliant and cunning Athenian general, had already begun executing the second half of their desperate two-front strategy. The cities evacuated. Women, children, the elderly, all fled to the island of Salamis or other safe havens across the sea. When the Persian army arrived, they found Athens deserted, its streets empty, its houses hollow. Rage consumed Xerxes. This city, which had dared defy his father, dared defy him now even in absence, and so he ordered Athens burned. Flames roared through the sacred citadel, devouring the wooden roofs of temples, licking the marble columns until they blackened. The fire leapt skyward, a tower of orange and black visible from the surrounding isles. Refugees on Salamis watched their beloved city turn to ash. Mothers cried. Elderly men trembled. Young warriors clenched their fists until their nails drew blood. But amid the grief, something else stirred, something born not of despair, but of resolve. If Leonidas and his 300 could stand against the Persian tide on land, then Athens would stand against it at sea. Across the straits, hidden among the rocky shores of Salamis, the Greek fleet waited. Themistocles watched from a cliff as the city burned, his eyes reflecting both sorrow and calculation. He knew he could not let the sacrifice at Thermopylae be wasted. The Spartan king had bought time. Now Themistocles would use it. He had lured the Persian fleet toward a narrow strait, where their overwhelming numbers would become a liability rather than an asset, much like the hot gates had turned Persia's strength into weakness. Xerxes, still seething with fury, believed Athens was already broken. He believed the Greek navy would scatter like frightened birds before his ships. And why shouldn't they? His fleet was enormous, a floating armada from Phoenicia, Egypt, Cyprus, an empire upon the sea. Confident of victory, he watched the strait from a golden throne positioned on a cliff overlooking the waters, determined to witness the moment Greece's resistance shattered forever. But the Strait of Salamis was no gift to Persia. It was a trap. When the Persian ships surged forward in their sprawling formations, eager to crush the Greek fleet, they found themselves colliding with one another, forced into tight channels where only a few ships could maneuver at a time. Oars tangled, hulls scraped, commanders shouted in panic. Then, like wolves leaping from the shadows, the Greek triremes struck. The narrow ships sliced through the water with terrifying speed, their bronze rams shattering Persian hulls, their soldiers boarding enemy decks with spears and shields. Battle cries echoed across the waves. Foam churned red. Themistocles' strategy unfolded with brutal precision. The Greeks moved like a single machine, swift, coordinated, deadly, while the Persians struggled to make sense of the chaos. Xerxes watched in horror as his navy, once the pride of the empire, began to drown before his eyes. Flames licked the decks of smashed warships. Sailors thrashed in the water. The sea itself seemed to rise in rebellion against Persia's arrogance. By sunset, the mightiest fleet the world had ever seen was reduced to broken timber and drifting corpses. Xerxes, shaken to his core, withdrew. He would never again attempt such an invasion in person. Though he left behind a large land force under his general Mardonius to continue the campaign, the king himself fled toward Asia, his divine aura now cracked, battered, and fragile. Yet even in retreat, the shadow of Persia still loomed over Greece. The war was far from over. And the spirit of vengeance burned hot in Greek hearts, fanned by memories of Leonidas and his fallen warriors. 1 year later, on the plains of Plataea, the Greeks would gather once more, Sparta, Athens, Corinth, fighting not as rivals but as brothers. There, they would crush the remnants of the Persian army, bringing Xerxes' grand invasion to its final ruin. But that tale belongs to the next rise of the sun. For now, the message of Thermopylae had already transformed the world. Empires can burn cities, but they cannot burn courage. They cannot burn freedom. They cannot burn the memory of men who chose death over submission. And because of that, the spark ignited at the hot gates was turning not into ashes, but into destiny.